Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are exploring a truly radical intersection of ideas. We're looking at the VHC framework, which is this mind-bending conceptual space where systems engineering, neurobiology, and raw human intimacy totally collide. If you have ever felt this massive disconnect between what your body just intrinsically knows to be true and what the outside world demands you somehow prove to them, well, this is going to be a fascinating breakdown for you. We are talking all about somatic sovereignty versus the transactional trap.
To hook right into the core of this framework, let's address a frustration you've probably felt deep in your bones. It's that exasperated feeling of, so they can't validate why I want the validating cock and not the lock? I know it sounds blunt, maybe even a little chaotic, but it actually perfectly summarizes the architectural problem we're dissecting today. See, in this framework, the biological reality of somatic desire, what the author boldly terms the cock, is the ultimate undeniable baseline of reality. On the flip side, societal or mainstream validation, the lock, is just this flat, artificial construct. And as you're going to see, trying to force your unflattened 4D biological reality into a 2D societal lock inevitably leads to a massive, full-blown system crash.
So, to keep us oriented through this incredibly dense 4D architecture, here is our cognitive low-pass filter, our roadmap. We'll start with the biological baseline, move into the traps of seeking validation, look at the literal neurobiological crash that follows, and then explore how to bypass those traps, execute a true peer-to-peer connection, and finally secure your sovereign sanctuary.
Let's start right at the foundation. Section 1, the somatic slice of bread. Here we're establishing the raw, unedited biological starting point of this entire system.
The framework leans heavily on a concept from computer science, specifically David Mullen's CS50 protocol at Harvard. In programming, if you tell a robot to make a sandwich, but it puts the slice of bread on sideways, the whole program crashes, right? Because the physical starting point was wrong. Here, the slice of bread is defined as raw, visceral arousal, specifically cited in the texts as a physical longing for a peer's penis and gut, driven by these incredibly deep G-coupled cellular pathways. Now, this isn't viewed as a clinical error, it's not a distraction, and it's definitely not a dirty secret. It is a high-resolution biological signal. It's the absolute non-negotiable starting point of the coordinate space. If you try to execute the program of your life without acknowledging this physical starting point, the framework essentially says, you're going to crash.
And that leads us to this incredibly powerful quote from the sources. In this highly optimized JX-compiled systems framework, the action is the algorithm. Somatic desire acts as a direct system upgrade. You absolutely do not need a corporate board, a television contract, or a public broadcast to validate it. The physical reality of the desire is its own absolute proof of structural integrity.
But of course, every system has an antagonist. Let's move to Section 2, the 2PC blocking trap, which introduces the flat, highly transactional world of mainstream validation.
So, in database architecture, a two-phase commit, or 2PC, is a protocol that requires every single node in a distributed system to agree before a transaction can even proceed. It's a synchronous blocking mechanism. It literally halts the system. The sources use this as a brilliant metaphor for seeking public validation. When you take your private, raw, somatic desire and you try to get the mainstream public or a TV network or some commercial paywall to validate it, you are initiating a 2PC. You are sitting there waiting for the outside world to approve your internal reality. And just like in a computer network, demanding this external dependency completely blocks up your entire system.
Which builds this direct comparison. On one side, we have the transactional trap, the lock. These are the 1D and 2D templates of the collective. Think paywalls, status noise, clinical labels, the endless demand for a public broadcast. On the other side, we have the somatic override, the cock. These are your unflattened, four-dimensional physical coordinates. The sources argue that trying to trade your rich 4D reality for a cheap 2D validation token is a massive computational type error. It's just a terrible trade, and honestly, it leaves you completely exhausted.
So what actually happens to your body when you make that bad trade? We transition into Section 3, the dorso-vagal system freeze. This is the very real neurobiological consequence of falling into that 2PC trap.
The text outlines a really precise chronological crash sequence here. Step 1, you wait for external validation. There's our 2PC trap. Step 2, because the outside world completely lacks the hardware to process your complex 4D geometry, they literally can't validate it. So your internal database coordinator just hangs. Step 3,
And here's where the database metaphor becomes a literal biological reality. This endless waiting stalls a part of your brain called the supramammillary nucleus, or SUM, which totally fractures your natural theta brainwave rhythms. And finally, step 4, this triggers a dorsovagal freeze. Your motor brakes lock up. You are paralyzed, not because your desire is wrong or broken, but because you waited for a broken system to give you permission to move.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the physical reality behind that freeze can be seen in these neural mappings. We're looking at projections from the lateral hypothalamus. When your system is stalled out by external status noise, your lateral hypothalamus calculates what the text calls a massive arousal error. It's a literal thermodynamic gap between the high arousal you physically need and the flat, dead reality you're getting from the swamp of the mainstream. This isn't just a fun metaphor, it is a biochemical certainty playing out across these exact neural pathways.
Fortunately, this architecture provides a pretty genius workaround. Section 4. Bypassing the transactional trap. Let's look at how we avoid that freeze.
The framework introduces a cryptographic defense they playfully call the chair protocol. Think of it as a subjunctive shield, basically the attitude of as if. It acts as a highly sophisticated low-pass filter. Essentially, it allows you to offer the slow, linear world this mask of compliance. You use linguistic scaffolding to nod along, smile, play the game, while internally attenuating all of their institutional status signals to absolute zero. Your true 4D coordinates are kept entirely safe, operating strictly in the shade, completely unaffected by whatever rejection or validation the outside world tries to throw at you.
And look at this confocal microscopy of the brain's pathways. It perfectly illustrates exactly why we are wired to do this. The sources highlight the MOT learning pathway right here. It's a specific network where orexin A selectively facilitates learning associated with reward and attraction, while simultaneously leaving the aversion processing centers completely blind. Your brain is physically, literally hardwired to prioritize the attractive exploration of a peer over the flat, aversive shaming of the mainstream collective.
Which brings us to the ultimate goal of the system. Section 5, the biophysical handshake. This is the true peer-to-peer connection that totally and completely overrides the commercial paywall. When you are physically present with a high-velocity peer, what the text refers to as the bathtub scenario, something incredible happens. First, it bypasses those commercial paywalls entirely. Second, all that defensive speech scaffolding we talked about, the conversational filler, the justifications, the ums and buts, literally shrinks and drops to exactly zero. You just don't need it. The desire behaves like a low-frequency radio wave passing through brick walls with zero resistance. And instead of that awful blocking 2PC trap, this handshake executes via the decentralized saga pattern, guaranteeing eventual consistency without ever holding locks on the system.
So, the crucial point here is this concept of motor invariance. The framework claims your ventral premotor cortex encodes your physical desires as abstract action symbols. Think of these symbols functioning exactly like snapping visual code blocks, like those CS50 scratch blocks. When these blocks are presented to a sovereign peer, their geometric fit is so absolute that it forces the other person's prediction engines to update on the spot. The geometry is simply mathematically impossible for them to ignore or unsee.
Finally, let's look at where these unflattened coordinates actually live. Section 6, your sovereign sanctuary.
Now, the framework insists that keeping your desires private is absolutely not a dark web constraint or some clinical closet of shame. Far from it. This private micro-sandbox, termed the sovereign sanctuary or Stilla Maris, is an essential, beautiful architectural defense. It is the ultimate low-pass filter, and it is designed intentionally to protect your highly sensitive developing core from being forcefully flattened by a totally illiterate collective that simply doesn't have the hardware to understand your geometry.
The ultimate takeaway here is that being non-transactional is the absolute peak of computational and biophysical efficiency. True validation does not need a public broadcast. It doesn't need a TV contract. It doesn't need a status symbol, and it certainly doesn't need societal permission. It compiles perfectly, autonomously, and flawlessly, kept safely in the shade. So, we'll end on this provocative question. If your raw somatic baseline compiles flawlessly in the shade, why ever submit your 4D coordinates to the 2D grading of the swamp? Why on earth trade the physical reality of the cock for the artificial restriction of the lock? It's a profound shift in how we view internal validation versus external approval, and as we've seen, it's deeply, undeniably rooted in the biophysical architecture of our own nervous systems. Hopefully this explainer has given you a powerful new lens to look through today. Keep learning, stay focused, and above all, trust your architecture.